The year is 1918 and the palace is still. Not the peaceful stillness of a quiet evening, but the breathless, eerie stillness that falls over a place when everyone knows something irreversible has just happened. Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna, a building so vast it makes Versailles look modest, sits at the center of one of the greatest empires the world has ever known. Or rather, it did. Because in November of that year, in the span of a few stunned weeks, 6 centuries of Habsburg rule simply ended. The last emperor of Austria signed a document, walked out of those gilded halls, and the world that had existed before was gone. Not reformed, not restructured, gone. And here is the question that has always fascinated me. What on earth do you do next when you are the heir to 600 years of empire and suddenly you are nobody? The answer, as it turns out, is one of the strangest, most heartbreaking, and ultimately remarkable stories in modern European history. And it begins not with a flourish, but with a piece of paper. To understand what happened to the Habsburgs after the empire fell, you first have to appreciate just how enormous that empire was, and just how long it had lasted. The House of Habsburg had ruled over a patchwork of Central European lands since the late medieval period. At the height of their power, they controlled not just Austria and Hungary, but Bohemia, Croatia, parts of Italy, eventually Spain, and at one point territories stretching into the Americas. They were not just a royal family, they were practically a synonym for European civilization. Other dynasties rose and fell around them. Napoleon came, reshuffled the map, and went. The Habsburgs remained. They arranged marriages across the continent with such strategic precision that it was practically an art form. One famous saying about them, and it really was said, went something like this: "Let others wage war, but you, happy Austria, marry." And it worked. For centuries it worked. The marriage of Maximilian I to Mary of Burgundy in 1477 alone delivered the Low Countries into Habsburg hands without a single battle fought. Philip II's claim to the Spanish throne brought silver from the Americas flooding into Vienna. These were not lucky accidents. They were the results of decades of deliberate dynastic engineering, pursued across generations with the patience that only a family secure in its own permanence could afford. But no dynasty, however ancient, however well-connected, is proof against the particular catastrophe that was the First World War. By 1914, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as it had been formally known since 1867, was already showing its age. It was a complicated place, home to dozens of ethnic groups, languages, and competing nationalisms, all compressed into one imperial frame, held together partly by tradition, partly by bureaucracy, and partly by sheer Habsburg prestige. When a Bosnian Serb named Gavrilo Princip shot Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in June of 1914, he did not just kill an heir to the throne. He pulled the pin from a grenade that had been quietly ticking for decades. The empire went to war. It struggled. It bled. And by November 1918, with Germany collapsing on the Western Front and revolutions stirring in the streets of Vienna, Emperor Karl I, the young, earnest, deeply Catholic man who had inherited this impossible situation just 2 years earlier, found himself with almost no options left. Karl I is a figure worth pausing on because he tends to get overlooked in histories that focus on the bigger players of the First World War. He came to the throne in 1916, in the middle of the catastrophe, at the age of 29. He had not been raised as the heir. His great-uncle Franz Ferdinand was supposed to take the throne until Sarajevo changed everything. Karl was genuinely idealistic. He made secret attempts to negotiate a separate peace for Austria without telling his German allies, a move that, when it leaked, infuriated Germany and further isolated him. He cared, by most accounts, deeply about his people and about peace. None of it was enough. By November 1918, the empire was dissolving around him, not through conquest, but through the simple, centrifugal force of nationalism. Czechoslovakia declared independence. Hungary separated. Yugoslavia began to coalesce. The empire did not so much fall as evaporate. And on November 11th, the same day the armistice ended the war on the Western Front, Karl signed a document in which he renounced participation in affairs of state. He did not technically abdicate, a distinction his family would hold on to tightly in the years to come. But effectively, it was over. He left Schönbrunn Palace for the last time, took his wife, Empress Zita, and their children, and disappeared into the uncertain world of exile. What came next is where the story gets genuinely strange. The new Austrian Republic was not content simply to let the Habsburgs go quietly. In 1919, the Austrian government passed what became known as the Habsburg Laws, a set of statutes that formally banished all members of the House of Habsburg from Austrian territory and confiscated the family's vast property holdings unless individual family members formally renounced their dynastic rights and titles. Think about what that means for a moment. In one legislative stroke, a family that had defined the country for centuries was told, "You may return only if you agree to become ordinary citizens." Many of them refused. Karl himself refused. And so the family scattered across Europe, to Switzerland, to Spain, to France, to Hungary, carrying with them their titles, their memories, and almost nothing else. The confiscated properties alone represented staggering wealth. The Habsburgs had owned hundreds of thousands of acres of land, dozens of castles, forests, hunting grounds, and art collections assembled over half a millennium. The 1919 laws transferred much of it to the new Austrian state virtually overnight. What had taken 6 centuries to accumulate was legislated away in months. Karl, however, was not a man inclined to accept the situation passively. In 1921, he made not one but 2 extraordinary attempts to reclaim the throne of Hungary. Hungary at this point was technically still a kingdom, just a kingdom without a king, governed by a regent named Miklos Horthy. Karl arrived in Hungary on 2 separate occasions, the second time by airplane, accompanied by Empress Zita, fully intending to walk back into power. The Hungarian nobility was divided. Some were loyal, but Horthy, under intense pressure from the surrounding Allied powers who had absolutely no interest in seeing a Habsburg restoration, refused to support him. The second attempt came disturbingly close to civil war. Karl was taken into custody, and this time the Allies intervened decisively. They could not have a former emperor rattling around Central Europe making bids for power. Karl and Zita were put aboard a British warship and transported to Madeira, a Portuguese island out in the Atlantic Ocean, far from anywhere that mattered to European politics. It was, in every practical sense, a very comfortable cage. Karl I died in Madeira in April 1922. He was 34 years old. The official cause was a lung infection. The island's damp winters were brutal on his health, but anyone reading the story today can feel the weight of everything else pressing down on that diagnosis. Exile, humiliation, failed bids for restoration, poverty relative to everything he had known. The family had very little money on Madeira, surviving partly on the charity of Catholic supporters. Zita was left a widow with 8 children in a foreign country, with no real prospect of return. She was 29 years old. The story of Empress Zita alone could fill a documentary. She refused, throughout her entire extraordinarily long life, to accept that the empire was truly gone. She never publicly renounced her title. She dressed in black mourning for years after Karl's death. And she outlasted almost everything, living until 1989, watching the Cold War, watching communism rise and fall, watching the world change beyond recognition around her. She finally returned to Vienna for her funeral, a woman who had been born into the old world and died just as the new one was reshaping itself yet again. Thousands lined the streets to watch her coffin pass. But it is Zita and Karl's eldest son, Otto, who truly carries the most remarkable arc of this entire story. Otto von Habsburg was born in 1912, which means he was 6 years old when the empire collapsed. He grew up in exile, educated across Europe, shaped by loss and displacement, and fully conscious from a young age that he was, in the eyes of many, the rightful emperor of Austria and king of Hungary, whether anyone in power chose to recognize it or not. For decades, the Austrian government refused to allow him to return because he refused to sign the declaration renouncing his claims. He was technically stateless for years, carrying around documents from various sympathetic organizations rather than a real passport. His situation was so legally ambiguous that when he wanted to travel, he sometimes relied on identification issued by the Order of Malta, a sovereign entity without a territory, issuing travel papers to a claimant without a throne. And yet Otto was not a bitter man, nor an idle one. He studied, he wrote, he lectured. He became deeply engaged with the idea of a unified, peaceful Europe, almost as if he had taken the failure of empire and transformed it into something new. In the 1950s and the 1960s, he became one of the most prominent intellectual advocates for European integration. He saw in the emerging European community something that rhymed, however distantly, with the multi-ethnic, multilingual empire his family had once governed. It is one of history's more poignant ironies. Eventually, in 1961, Otto did sign the declaration renouncing his dynastic claims, not because he accepted that his family had no legitimate history, but because he wanted to go home. He wanted to walk on Austrian soil again. He became an Austrian citizen and later a Bavarian resident, and later still, in one of those historical moments that feels almost too perfect to be true, a member of the European Parliament representing Bavaria, sitting as an elected representative in the very institution he had long championed. He served in the European Parliament for over 2 decades. He was charming, multilingual in the extreme, and deeply popular. He died in 2011 at the age of 98, and his funeral was, by all accounts, something extraordinary. Part state occasion, part pilgrimage, held in Vienna's St. Stephen's Cathedral with the heads of European royalty and government in attendance. He was buried in the imperial crypt in Vienna, in the same vault where generations of Habsburgs had rested for centuries. Following Habsburg tradition, his heart was buried separately in Hungary. And here, if you've been enjoying this journey through history with us, I'd love to invite you to stick around Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and join a community of people who genuinely love digging into stories like this one. We cover history's greatest mysteries, forgotten dynasties, lost civilizations, and the moments that changed the world. Anyway, back to the Habsburgs, because the story doesn't end there. Karl I, the last emperor, was beatified by Pope John Paul II in 2004, meaning the Catholic Church formally recognized him as Blessed Karl, the first step toward potential sainthood. The cause for his canonization had been building for decades, championed by Catholics who saw in his short life evidence of deep personal holiness and genuine commitment to peace. It is a remarkable coda to a tragic story, and not without controversy, and some historians point to the suffering the empire inflicted on its subject peoples and find the elevation unsettling. Others argue that Karl personally tried to limit that suffering and was largely powerless against forces far bigger than himself. Both things can be true at once, and that tension is, I think, what makes his story so genuinely interesting rather than simply sad. The Beatification ceremony in Rome drew thousands of faithful from Austria, Hungary, and across the former imperial lands, people who still felt, nearly a century later, a personal connection to this man and what he had represented. A foundation bearing his name continues to operate in Vienna today, documenting his life and promoting his cause for full canonization. The Habsburg family today is still very much present. Karl von Habsburg, Otto's son, born in 1961, carries the family's public identity forward. He is involved in humanitarian and conservation work, sits on various European cultural boards, and travels widely. He has been an Austrian television personality and a public intellectual in his own right. There are other Habsburgs too, spread across Europe, living lives ranging from the quietly aristocratic to the thoroughly ordinary. They hold no political power, they rule nothing. But the name still carries extraordinary weight in Austria, in Hungary, in the Czech Republic, in all the lands that were once part of the empire. The imperial crypt in Vienna, where so many of them are buried, draws visitors every single day. People stand there reading names that echo through centuries and feel something, a kind of vertigo maybe, at the sheer length of time one family shaped the destiny of a continent. So what do we make of all this? The fall of the Habsburgs is often told as a story purely about the collapse of the old order, the inevitable crumbling of an ancient structure that had simply lasted too long. And there is truth in that, but the part that follows is less often told, and it is stranger and more human and ultimately more interesting. A family stripped of everything, land, palace, empire, country, scattered across a hostile continent, and yet they did not simply vanish into obscurity. They adapted. Some clung fiercely to the past. Others, like Otto, transformed their inherited identity into something new and forward-looking. Empress Zita outlived the century that destroyed her world. Karl I was declared blessed by one of the oldest institutions in Western civilization. The family name still echoes in Vienna's streets, in its architecture, in its music, in the crypt beneath the Kapuzinerkirche, where the silver coffins are stacked in rows. The deeper question, and it is one I keep coming back to, is what a dynasty actually is. Is it a political structure? That was gone by 1918. Is it land and wealth? The Habsburg laws took most of that. Is it a bloodline? That continues. Or is it something harder to define, a set of ideas, a sense of responsibility, A particular way of understanding Europe and what it might be? If so, then the Habsburgs did not end in November 1918. They transformed. And transformation, as anyone who has studied history long enough knows, is often a stranger and more durable thing than power. I'd love to know what you think. Leave a comment below. Do you think the Habsburgs represented a genuinely positive force in European history, or were they an old structure that simply collapsed under its own weight? There is no wrong answer here, and the debate is genuinely fascinating. And if you want to follow that thread further, I think you'll find the story of the last days of the Ottoman Empire, another ancient power that collapsed in the same post-war moment, rhymes with this one in ways that will absolutely catch you off guard. That one is coming up soon on this channel. If you are not subscribed yet, now is a great time. We would love to have you with us as we keep digging. Until next time, thank you for spending this time with history. It never stops being strange.